is a 2004 Ford Mustang SVT Cobra, and it's an absolute muscle car legend. Back when this was new, there was no Hellcat. This was the Hellcat of the 2000s, and this one is finished in one of the greatest automotive paint colors of all time. I have always wanted to review this car, and today, finally, I'm gonna do it. Before I get started, big news, this Terminator Cobra is currently for sale, being auctioned live on Cars and Bids, which is my enthusiast car auction website. This is a final year 04 Terminator Cobra in the best color with low mileage, and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So, once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to head over to the live auction for this Mustang Cobra, where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. So let's talk Terminator Cobra. This car really was an icon with a supercharged V8 that made about 400 horsepower, which was a big number back in the 2000s. It was kind of a dark time for muscle cars. These were only on sale for 2 years and prices have already started to rise. I think this is an obvious future classic. And today I'm going to show you everything. First, I'll take you on a thorough tour of the Terminator Cobra and show you all of its interesting quirks and features. Then I'll get it out on the road and drive it, and then I'll give it a Doug score. All right, I'm going to start the quirks and features of the Terminator Cobra with the color of this one. This is called Mistachrome, and you can see it's color changing. In some lights it's green, in others it's dark blue, in others it's purple, and depending on your perspective, you can see all of those colors at once on different panels. And as you move around the car, like you see, they change color. It is a color changing chameleon paint, which I think is the coolest thing in the world. Now, Mistachrome was an option on the Mustang Cobra. It was not standard. It was a $3,700 option when this car was new, which was big money back in 2004. And it was only offered on the 2004 Cobra models in order to commemorate 40 years of the Mustang, which of course came out in 1964. Now, like I said, this color was optional. There were other colors that you could get on the Mustang Cobra, but this was by far the coolest, and Ford only made about 1,000 Mustang Cobras in this Mistachrome color, roughly split evenly, half and half, between coupes and convertibles. So there are not many of these out there, and they are very, very special. Now, this paint technology was apparently developed by DuPont, although my understanding is, I guess BASF is the paint supplier for this exact color in this car, but regardless, there is an enormous amount of conjecture and hype and lore and stories about this paint color. People say that Ford won't let anybody touch the paint, and so if you get your car scratched, a factory representative flies out from Michigan with a can of the paint in his luggage, and he supervises the body shop painting it, and then he takes the rest of the paint back to Michigan so it never gets outside of Ford's sealed Mistachrome paint area. This is what people have always said about this color, and frankly, it doesn't seem like it's true. I've spent a lot of time reading on the forums about this color, and you can order a pint or extra paint for this car if you have a scratch or some damage, and they'll send it to you, but it is tremendously expensive, hundreds of dollars for a pint. And then of course you have to try to blend the panels and match them to get it to look like it wasn't painted, which can also be tricky. And the cost also means that a full repaint of this car would be in the tens of thousands of dollars. So any damage is very expensive, but it's worth it for this incredibly special color on this incredibly special car. And by the way, the Mistachrome exterior color wasn't the only Mistachrome thing about this car. Ford also worked with its suppliers to get a Mistachrome colored interior, and so you can see the seats actually have the same color effect in their seat centers. The front seats and the rear seats have sort of the purple, green, blue, depending on exactly where you're looking, and all of the Mistachrome exterior cars also had a matching Mistachrome interior to go along with it. And it didn't stop there. They also had Mistachrome on the steering wheel. You can see a few of the leather sections of the steering wheel are finished in Mistachrome, just like the exterior and the seats, so it all tied in together, a tremendously special color inside and out. But this car is not only cool for its amazing color, but also for its performance, and specifically the story of how its performance came to be. So here's what happened. Back in '99, Ford came out with the SVT Cobra model based on its latest Mustang, and they said it had 320 horsepower from a naturally aspirated V8. That wasn't a great number, but people were okay with it until they started putting the cars on dynos and magazines started doing tests, and they found out the actual power number was more like 280 or 290. And then, as you can imagine, the lawsuits started. So Ford issued a stop sale order. They modified the remaining 99 Mustangs they hadn't sold to try to get extra power out of them, and they skipped the entire 2000 model year while they were retooling the Cobra in order to actually make the power that they advertised. As you can imagine, this was a bit of an embarrassment for the people at Ford's Special Vehicle Teams, SVT, who made the Cobra. So while they were modifying the existing Cobra to make the power they said it did, they were also cooking up something special. And for 2003, they came out with this, the Terminator Cobra. That was the code name for this car at SVT, and it had all the power. 390 horsepower from a supercharged version, the same V8, and 390, as it turned out, was underrated. This time, magazines and consumers did dyno tests and found these cars were really making something like 420 or 430 horsepower, but Ford was conservative because they didn't want anybody to accuse them of faking the horsepower numbers anymore. Now, 430 horsepower even today is a big figure, but back in the early to mid 2000s, it was huge, especially for muscle cars. There was no Dodge Challenger or Charger. They didn't exist, and the Chevy Camaro had just been canceled entirely. This was all that was left, and it was a lot. As for performance numbers, 0 to 60 was in the mid 4-second range, which was big back then and frankly still is today, and this would run a quarter in the 12s. It was also electronically limited to 153 miles an hour, but people say if you pull off the limiter, this would do 180 miles an hour in a Mustang from the early 2000s, which was pretty serious. And frankly, I love looking under the hood at this engine. You can see the supercharger, you can see that Ford and SVT were embarrassed about the earlier Cobra problems, and they just threw everything they could under this hood to make this car fast. That was the edict, and that is what happened, clearly. I also love the little plaque over on the side that says SVT, hand built with pride, and has the signatures of the people who actually built this engine, and frankly, it was a special one. But Ford realized in developing the Terminator Cobra that they had to do more than just give it extra power. They also had to give it some visual distinctions from earlier Cobras to show that this model was different and that this model meant business. So they brought in designer Camillo Pardo, the same person who designed the 2005 Ford GT, in order to make some tweaks to this car to make sure it stood out from the earlier Cobra. And the tweaks are actually pretty comprehensive as you look around. For example, the front bumper is different. You have a completely different front fascia up there with larger openings, which allowed more air to go to the brakes in order to cool them. You also had a new rear fascia. Around back, the lower part of the rear bumper was switched to black in order to distinguish or highlight the dual exhausts and make the Cobra stand out a little bit more. You also had different scoops on the side. They were a little bit larger, a little bit musclier, again to help emphasize that this was a different Cobra. And you had body-colored mirrors because Ford cheaped out on the earlier Cobras and gave them plastic mirrors. That was gone for the Terminator. They were now painted the same color as the rest of the car. You also had another dead giveaway that you were looking at a Terminator, and that was the hood. It was bulgier and it had these two vents. These are actually heat extractors to get heat away from the engine. The earlier Cobra models didn't have that. Also available were chrome wheels. They were standard on all of the Mistachrome models, but optional on other SVT Cobras, and if you got them, that helped distinguish your Terminator from an earlier car too. And you had different side skirts. They were flatter, a little bit simpler than what you had in the earlier Cobras, again giving it a slightly different look. The last really obvious change to the Terminator Terminator Cobras was this spoiler mounted on the trunk lid, which was different from what you got in the earlier Cobras, and again had a little bit of a different look if you knew what you were looking for. Now, extra power and all these changes in the Terminator Cobra was only sold in 2 model years, 2003 and 2004. After that, a new Mustang came out for 05, and Ford ditched the Cobra name altogether, preferring, I guess, to use Shelby for their performance models. And the Cobra hasn't come back since. So this was kind of the swan song of the Cobra 20 years ago, the amazing, powerful Terminator. It lasted just 2 years. But anyway, next we move on to the rest of the quirks and features in the Terminator Cobra, and I'm gonna start inside, where I have to say, no matter how powerful this car was, no matter how special, no matter how rare, no matter how cool, the drawback to the Terminator Cobra was always the same, and that was the interior quality. This was the last Mustang made before Ford really started to upgrade the interiors in the Mustang and make it a nicer place to be, and this one just isn't really all that nice. There's a lot of cheap plastic in here. You can see a lot of simple, basic, cheap switches carried over from other Ford models. It just doesn't look all that good in this car. It just wasn't that nice, and it wasn't really the point. Ford offered this car as cheap speed. It was a true muscle car. You were buying an engine, a transmission, a driveline, and not really all that much else when you bought a Terminator Cobra. And so they didn't need to make the interior nice. It was part of keeping the cost down, but the result is the interior just isn't really all that nice. And it's especially clear today, in an era of nicer Mustangs, how kind of cheap this interior feels. Now, the main design element in this interior was kind of unusual. You had 2 like pods on the dashboard, oval-shaped pods for the driver and for the passenger, which I guess was a throwback to older Mustang models, and it was kind of a weird look, but that's what they did. Now, on the passenger side, you also had the word Mustang written out in this sort of heritage font to look cool and kind of a throwback to the old days. The weird part was they also wrote SRS in this font, which stands for Supplemental Restraint System, or airbag. Most automakers just printed it on the airbag cover, but they wrote it in the cursive heritage font, which was strange, and they did the same thing on the steering wheel. Again, SRS, this weird cursive. Not sure why they did that, but they did. Now, also on the steering wheel, you can see printed the word Cobra going across the middle, which is kind of interesting because there's not all that much Cobra badging in this interior. You also had a little Cobra snake that was stitched into the backrest of the seat. As you can see, both of the front seats had that little Cobra there, and you had white-faced gauges in the Cobra models that said SVT on the tachometer, but that was pretty much it in terms of badging in this interior. There really wasn't all that much to set this apart from other Mustang models. Now, you did get one cool badge, which is, of course, the horse logo at the top of the windshield. You can see this on the outside, but you can also see it on the inside, reminding you perpetually that you're in a Mustang. Also, another interesting Mustang badge in the interior is in the door sill, although when you open the door, you don't see it. That's because it's incredibly tiny, this little Mustang script. Ford obviously didn't want to spend any money on this, so they made like the world's smallest Mustang script when you open the door, but it is there reminding you that you have a Mustang. One other change for SVT Cobra models compared to regular Mustangs was the transmission. All SVT Cobras came with a manual, and it was a 6-speed manual, whereas the regular Mustang GT from this era came only with a 5-speed manual. So if you wanted that extra gear, you got the Cobra, and that's a distinction you can see in here. Now, next up, obviously this is a convertible. Like I mentioned, there were SVT Cobra coupes and convertibles, but this one is a drop top, and that means the top goes up and down, although doing so is a little bit quirky. You have a little button here in the center you can use to move the top up or down, but it reminds you there's a step necessary before pressing that button, which is set park brake, as it says. You have to first put on the parking brake before you can do anything with the top, and then you can press this button and the top will automatically go up. As you can see, a nice power operated top in your Mustang. Once it gets to a position where it's sitting above the windshield, all you have to do manually is latch it into place, and then your roof is on, and you can take off the parking brake. Pretty simple. And of course, if you want the top to go down, you just do it the other way. First, put on the parking brake, the first step, and then unlatch the top from the windshield with the 2 latches above the visors, and then just press the button and watch the top automatically go back so you can enjoy the open road and the sunny skies in your Terminator Cobra, which is pretty cool. One other interesting operation in this car is removing the key from the ignition. You stick the key in like normal, just stick it in, twist it, and the car starts right up. But to get it out, you can't just turn the car off and pull it out. Instead, you have to push on this little switch directly above the ignition, and only then can you take the key out, which is kind of annoying in various circumstances if you're just trying to get out quickly and you don't want to have to like reach up with a different finger while you're simultaneously pulling on the key. But this was a common thing cars had in the 70s and 80s. I guess the Mustang carried it through 2004. But anyway, next we move on to the back seat in the Terminator Cobra, and I gotta say, there is absolutely nothing interesting happening in these back seats aside from the fact that they are Mistachrome, which frankly is pretty interesting actually, and very cool. Now, as you can imagine, the back seat is quite small. Even if I move up the front seat, there's not really a lot of space. So this was reserved for like storage, or maybe children, or maybe adults for very short trips and very limited time. Now, there is one other interesting thing about the back seats in this car, and that is that there is a rear window that rolls up separately from the front window. The rear passengers can't control it. There's no power window switch back here, but the driver has access to rear window controls, and you can put up this rear quarter window separately from the front window if you want to. So in theory, you could drive around with the roof down, the windows down, but this rear quarter window up in place if you just want to confuse people. Kind of strange to see that operate separately from the front window. Usually in convertibles they're together, but not in this Mustang. But anyway, next we move on to the outside of this Mustang Cobra, and aside from the Mistachrome, which is very cool, there are also a few other quirks and features worth noting, one of which is badging. Now up front, I love the floating Mustang badge in the grille. Looks like it's just sort of suspended there. A lot of the Mustang models from this era had this, so it's not that rare or special and not unique to the Cobra, but I've always felt it was a pretty cool look. But other than that, the interesting thing about badging for this car is, once again, there's not all that much SVT badging on the outside. You had SVT center caps on the wheels, but of course that is tremendously small, and you had this little Cobra on the front fenders on either side, but that was pretty subtle, and it was subtle still in the back where you had one more SVT logo, and that was pretty much it. The largest giveaway on the outside of this car that it's a Cobra was on the rear bumper, where you can see Cobra is actually stamped into the bumper itself, but it wasn't painted a different color. It was just the body color, so in some lights you couldn't even really see that it even said Cobra back there, but it was there and part of the relatively subtle badging this car had. But then again, with that in mind, maybe badging wasn't really necessary on the outside of this car, because you could see it go fast and you could hear it. This car has an aftermarket exhaust. It's the only modification to this Cobra, and it sounds fantastic. Take a listen to the Terminator Cobra. Give us some revs. But anyway, since I'm back here, I want to talk trunk for a second, cargo area. A couple of interesting things. First, getting access to the cargo area. For one, this deck lid spoiler, like I mentioned, is cool looking, and it helps set apart the Terminator Cobras from earlier models, but it's also sitting on the trunk where the keyhole is to get into the trunk. And that meant they actually had to poke a hole inside the spoiler in order to carve out a space for the keyhole, and so it's kind of deep to stick your key in there. Now, that's not the only way you can open the trunk, of course. There's also a little button on the key fob, which you will notice is just the same key fob from every other Ford vehicle of this era. This special Terminator Cobra Mustang just got the key fob from the Taurus and the Windstar and everything else. Although that shouldn't be too much of a surprise, because the Ford GT had the same thing. This was a special car, but that was a supercar, and it still used the standard Ford square key fob. But anyway, you open up the trunk, press this little button on the key fob, pop it open, and then you get back here and discover very quickly it's small. This is a small trunk with a small trunk opening, which is kind of a surprise. You can see space was not maximized in this car, and it's not especially practical. You do have some room in this trunk. It's not like a supercar, but it's not as big as modern Mustangs, and it's not as big as you might expect. Now, the other interesting thing to me on the trunk is the inside of the trunk lid is indeed painted in Mistachrome, because of course it is. That's the production process. They paint the whole panel, but it's crazy to imagine. That's an expensive panel that's been painted that no one will ever see. But you're seeing it now, so you can understand and appreciate the Mistachrome trunk lid inside. By the way, one other interesting quirk of this car on the outside, how about the antenna? A fixed antenna, which now seems so ridiculous. Automakers like hide them in windshields and glass. But back in the day, you had fixed antennas, even on crazy performance cars like this. Clearly, this vehicle is a relic from a different era where you had cheap interiors, fixed antennas, and a lot of power. And so those are the quirks and features of the Terminator Mustang Cobra. Now it's time to get it out on the road and see how it drives. All right, driving the Terminator Cobra. Oh yeah. I don't want to pull a Mustang here, but oh, that sound, and this is fast. Really seriously fast. Now, before I talk about driving experience anymore, I want to discuss why I haven't reviewed one of these yet. For years, people have been saying to me, Doug, you gotta review a Terminator Cobra. Why haven't you reviewed a Terminator Cobra? Come on, come on. The answer is I was looking for this car. I wanted to do a Mistachrome because it's one of the coolest colors of all time, and I wanted to do one that was unmodified. And people have reached out to me locally with them and said, hey, I have one, but it's got, it's lowered, and it's got these wheels, and it's got this cam, and blah, blah, blah. It's not what I wanted. And so I drove all the way to Phoenix from Southern California, about 7 hours, just to drive this car because I have wanted to do it for so long. Now, the other cool thing, I have a 2005 Ford GT, so I have like the other Ford pinnacle performance car from this era, and I've always wanted to check out the Terminator Cobra because it was just bonkers. A lot of people are going to watch this video and say, oh, he's freaking out over 400 horsepower. Yeah, I was there. I was that age. This car came out when I was 15 years old. I mean, I remember how insane the power was at the time. The Camaro had just been canceled. We thought it would never come back. There was no Hellcat. There wasn't even a Challenger or a Charger. The muscle car was not around in the mid-2000s. And this car was like the last glimmer of hope that could still be a thing. So what's it like to drive? The answer is pretty damn cool. Woohoo! You hear that turbo? You hear that supercharger whine? It sounds so good. I love it, and I love the sound of this car. The owner told me he loves having his cars to be completely stock, but this one, an exhaust just opens it up. I get it. Oh. It also just feels good in this car. I really like the driving experience because it's just so basic. It's just so like throw it around. There's no like sport button and adjustable suspension and adjustable steering. This car is the sport mode. That's the whole thing. Now, I will say steering and handling is not quite on the level of modern Mustangs. I want to be careful how I phrase this because it's kind of interesting to me. I came here, I've never driven a Terminator Cobra before of any variety, and I came here thinking that it was gonna be fast but kind of suck otherwise. And that's true about the interior, there's no question about that. But actually it drives okay. It is certainly fast and it still feels fast today, which is really cool. But the steering and handling is not as bad as I was expecting. It's not as bad as what people say about muscle cars in this era. Now, to be clear, it's not amazing. Modern Mustangs have done an incredible job of really emphasizing a focus on precision steering and handling. And the new GT350, the latest one, is one of the great steering and handling cars on the market of any vehicle. And it wasn't like that back in this era, but it wasn't as bad as people say, and I'm kind of surprised by that. I was thinking the gear lever would be this like squidgy thing and the clutch would suck. I mean, you hear a lot of stories about Ford from this era making some crappy cars. And honestly, the base version of this Mustang was not regarded as the very best Mustang, or even close. Overall though, I gotta say, this car is damn cool. I have always sort of thought about getting a Terminator Cobra, and I kind of want one, and I kind of wish I had. I'm not a Mustang guy, really. Like, it's never been a thing I've been interested in, but this one is just really cool. And it's just like simple fun, and that was the cool thing about this car. It was just a muscle car. It just had a lot of power, and it delivered it. And you didn't get a nice interior, and you didn't get like high quality dealership service, and that wasn't what you were looking for. You just wanted to buy the car and go to the drag strip that night and beat Corvettes. And you could. Wow. Wow. And so that's the Terminator Mustang Cobra, the 2004 Ford Mustang SVT Cobra. This car is so cool, and this is the one you want. This year, this engine, this crazy color. And you can buy it on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give the Terminator Cobra a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 54 out of 100, which places the Mistachrome Cobra here against some similarly priced performance cars of its day. Truthfully, I loved the Mistachrome Cobra, and it exceeded my expectations, which were already high. I love the backstory of Ford over-promising power numbers on earlier Cobras, so they had to build a knockout. I love the acceleration, I love the engine sound, and I love the paint color. I think the Terminator Cobra is underrated, and I think it deserves to be more valuable, especially in this crazy color.